Hi everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and make a quick video for you. So the second today from December 1st, it started actually yesterday and all the way it's due today, is the Get Real. It's realism, literature, and the Civil War. So there's going to be realism. So I need you to think of realism as the umbrella, just like how we did Romanticism, and then you had Transcendentalism, you had Dark Romanticism. Well, Realism also has an umbrella. And under that umbrella, you have regionalism and you have naturalism. And then under regionalism and naturalism, you have what we call local color, which is in dialect. So this is what we're going to look for doing today. So here's the first thing. If you go to Unit 4, weeks 14 and 15, today in class we did the role of fear. This would be January, December 1st. And then now we're going to look at the second folder, which is Realism, Literature, and the Civil War, begins November 30th. So I'm going to have you go here to the Get Real. And this is a quick video. I'm going to have you guys watch this.
We've all heard the phrase get real at one time or another, usually when someone thinks we're being childish or living in a fantasy land. In American literature, the realist movement expresses a similar idea. Popular from around 1865 to 1900, realism challenged readers to look past myths, assumptions, social norms, and other expectations in order to see the world as it really is. To depict the world in this way, realist writers turned away from grandiose subject matter and instead focused on the lower and middle classes, depicting daily life in gritty and sometimes unpleasant detail.
Ew.
The assumption behind this strategy was that literature had the power to change society, and that by depicting life, warts and all, writers could improve the world without being too preachy about it. Historically, this effort to depict the world in honest, objective terms found its roots in the invention of photography and the proliferation of newspapers throughout the United States. Whereas painting made it fairly easy to romanticize subjects like war, photography offered stark depictions of its subject matter. And as the number of newspapers in America grew from around 700 in 1830 to over 5,000 in 1870, writers like Mark Twain and William Dean Howells adapted the tenets of journalism to fiction. Yet while Howells offered a fairly straightforward definition of the movement, by noting that realism is nothing more and nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, not all realists agreed on the best way to treat material truthfully. Authors like Mark Twain tended to practice a brand of realism known as regionalism. In The Notorious Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, for example, Twain uses dialect and the local flavor of the American West to highlight social and cultural differences between the story's narrator and the rambling Simon Wheeler. By way of contrast, authors like Charlotte Perkins Gilman found truth and reality in the thoughts and emotions of their characters. This trend is especially evident in The Yellow Wallpaper, which traces a young mother's descent into madness as she struggles with what today's readers might recognize as postpartum depression. Ultimately, however, what all realist authors had in common was an interest in truth and a belief that by honestly depicting the gritty details of everyday life, good writing could change the world.
Okay, so right there is kind of like our introduction um, to realism. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is actually the lesson in itself from the from our OLS. So I accidentally deleted the OLS's realism, and so basically I took it and I put it all into a PowerPoint, which is no big deal. Um, so what we have is we have in here The very first thing. So I'm just gonna open up the PowerPoint. Or I'm gonna attempt to. This is how this goes, right? About the moment you want something to open like it's supposed to. It's cool. Ah, here it is. Okay, so you had to take a couple seconds for that. All right, so here we go. So, realism, regionalism, and naturalism. So, the thoughts about Civil War and the continued westward expansion of America found their way into the works of American writers, artists, thinkers in the late 1800s. So, in this unit, which is I just lump it all together because honestly, the depictions of what you get in the Civil War are also very similar to what you're going to be getting in the writers from this time as well. So, you're going to look at the brutality of war, the diverse experience of people across the nation, changes in beliefs, and how environments environment influenced people affected the stories. Pardon the interruption. My um, alarm for my fire alarm started going off. That was a little random, but so, anyways, the experience of people of the nation, changes in the belief about how the environment influences people affected the stories, their speeches, essays, poetry of this period. So, um, the Civil War, the westward expansion, the nation's borders, and the continued arrival of immigrants from other nations dramatically changed America in the 19th century. Realism, regionalism, nationalism were three literary movements that emerged as this time and sought to capture life and depict it down to the smallest detail. So the video that we watched through showed someone like actually looked like they were throwing up. Okay, they didn't think that was anything nobody should see. Um, they thought it was a modern, commonplace thing. Even Charlotte Perkins, um, the yellow wallpaper in their commonplace of the like postpartum depression, they felt like that was necessary to talk about. Um, when I was hoping we could read Desiree's Baby, and we might be able to. I'm not sure about time for this piece. We might be able to fit it in next. But it was looking at the Creoles and also their viewpoints on um, people, like the kind of like how the French even had some prejudice, and but they weren't nearly as prejudiced towards African Americans as what they were um, of people who were their bloodlines were not pure. So they had like more of a class system type thing. But it's interesting. And Desiree's Baby really pulls that out because Desiree's Baby, um, well, I can't tell you because it'll run the surprise. Anyways, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna study these movements. And today our goal is to explore the state of the country during the aftermath of the Civil War. So this actually look at some of what happens after the Civil War, which is kind of like beforehand. I'm kind of getting this a little bit, maybe a little bit before, and you'll kind of get a little bit of ideas. Um, so there's some I might go kind of faster because we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I want you to kind of have an idea of what's coming. Anyways, examine the literary movements of realism, regionalism, naturalism, some of their chief practitioners, and the impact they had on American literature. Um, I doubt that we're going to have a chance to read The Return of a Private, even though it's an amazing story. But here's the thing. So after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, um, Vick's courthouse in Virginia in April of 1865. The wounds of the battle scar, but wounds of the war and the scars on the country lasted long after fighting ceased on the battlefield. So, what we're going to look about is what's that aftermath, what's going to happen. So, we have the cost of the Civil War, which is this is going to kind of go hand in hand with the one where it was like the cost of freedom. So, that's kind of go where this will go hand in hand too. So, the Civil War fought from 1861 to 1865 cost over 600,000 soldiers their lives in the country of 31 million people. This was a staggering number, yet there were other far-reaching negative aspects of the war, including there were many thousands of civilian deaths, serious injuries and to countless soldiers and civilians, massive displacement of people, widespread destruction of property, such as the utter destruction of Atlanta in the 1864 by the order of Union General William T. Sherman. So the brutality, though, of the war shocked soldiers and civilians alike on both sides of the conflict. This is why many of them were disillusioned. Like they were like, yeah, I can't really read Romanticism anymore because I've seen the brutality of what human nature really can do. Okay, so dark romanticism really explored the concept of sin and the human flaw, but this was like in their face, and it doesn't matter who they were, it was just right there. Um, when it comes to the massive displacement of people, we're really going to look at that in the orphan trains and what the cities look like and how it all in January. So Reconstruction, though, the years after the Civil War, the government faced the central issue of how to deal with the defeated Confederacy states and their citizen. So they were trying to rebuild the towns, they're reestablishing order, they're ensuring the rights, respect for the rights of the formerly enslaved people in the southern states, and they're trying to resolve the problems that resulted in the Civil War. So many Southerners, though, resented the federal government's efforts during Reconstruction. Lincoln did not believe secession was possible. From the start of the war, his goal was to save the Union and then reunite the country as quickly as possible, allowing almost all Southerners to return to the Union without punishment. But some Northerners favored punishing the South. They argued that the South had started the war, should not be allowed back into the Union so easily. In the South, violence erupted against carpetbaggers. These were the Southern name for Northerners who benefited from the Reconstruction against formerly enslaved people. Although the Union had survived its greatest test, the unity of the nation was tenuous. So these would be people that moved down there. And so now, while all this is going on, we have also this new frontiers. So who lived in these regions? So these were the most of were the displaced Native Americans, because mind you, we didn't just have African Americans who were wandering. They were wandering to the north, to the Great Migration, to where eventually what's going to lead to the Harlem Renaissance. But we also have Native Americans who are going to have to deal with the Trail of Tears, and they don't have a place to live. So then the Southerners, who had lost their property during the war, Northern immigrants seeking new opportunities, so they might go down. There were also unique challenges in each region, and the people developed viewpoints and their desires based on their experiences. So, although America was one country, it was not a place where all citizens had the same concerns and needs. What this means is that we have a lot of growth and expansion. Um, from the 1850s to 1900s, the population of the United States more than tripled. We had immigrants coming, flooding the United States. Um, especially and then the 15 states were added to the union. Most of these states were in the Midwest, Great Plains, in the West. So we had like Missouri already. We had the Missouri Compromise, which was a really big issue. We know this. So what happens though with the literary aspect? So then years after the Civil War, American writers recognized the changes that had taken place and were continuing to take place in the country, the ugly realities of war and its aftermath, along with the challenges faced by people in different parts of the country, called for new ways of writing. Um, so, to depict America and Americans accurately and effectively, writers of this period developed realism, regionalism, naturalism. These are the three literary movements that broke with the Romantic traditions of the early 1800s. So, this is where we are. So remember, the Romantics idea is people are perfectible, people are inherently good, people have the power to overcome any challenge or problem. The realist, People are not perfectible. People will act in ways that harm themselves and others. People are sometimes helpless in the face of outside forces, events, and circumstances. So, realist literature presents a slice of life as it actually is, not as people wish it could be. I'm sorry, but I love Hallmark movies. Not gonna lie. My kids like them. We watch them. My husband, on the other hand, is like, ugh. He says to my son yesterday, if you've watched one, you've watched them all. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but no, you haven't. So I'm more of a romantic when it comes to just enjoying a break from the realism of life and the downtrodden and things that I see on the news and whatever. So that's where I get that is from Hallmark, especially during Christmas. My favorite. So, anyways, so tenets of realism. So, now take a moment to review these key characteristics and tenets of realism. Realism is literature that is devoid of emotionalism, melodrama, or supernatural elements. So, it's not going to be dealing with like your witches or your like Devil and Tom Walker. You're not getting that. Okay. Um, it is going to face the gritty realities of life. It's going to throw up the soldiers lying dead on the battlefield, like seeing that type of thing. It's going to depict influence of outside forces, events, circumstances on the individual. You're going to see it as it is going on. Represents people, situations, and events as they really are. This movement, believe it or not, lasted for quite some time. It lasts almost till um, roughly. You have the Harlem Renaissance movement that comes in roughly the like 1920s, but realism lasts for almost 50 years, if not a little, maybe a little longer. And there's still even aspects of it when you read the poetry and some of that, like written by like Robert Frost and stuff. To those who have grown up when the Romantic tradition was dominant, the harsh representations of the world presented by realist authors were often jarring. Consequently, realism was considered to be a radical departure from the literary status quo that preceded it. So then we have naturalism, regionalism. Both natural and regionalism can be understood as smaller literary movements, both under the real umbrella of realism. For that reason, they share the characteristics of realist literature, but they also have unique characteristics of their own. So for the naturalist, it reflects the beliefs that individuals are the product of heredity and environment. Naturalist fiction tends to highlight how individuals are stripped of their power by the forces beyond their control. So, what that kind of means is nature. Okay. So, nature sometimes, you like Hurricane Katrina come through. There's nothing you can do. So, naturalism shows that we're relatively small um, in the realm of the world. Like we are relatively small. Like we cannot change nature. We cannot, and so that's just what it is. This focus on intense or extreme situations tend to put naturalist authors in a direct opposition to the optimism expressed by the Romantics. So, nature is beautiful. Like that's your transcendentalist ideas, but that's not your naturalist ideas. They're like, nope, nature can be harsh. It can be awful. So, like in the Dayton region, we had like 2 years ago in May, we had tornadoes just ripped apart areas of our like our area in Ohio. And that showed you the devastation and the aftermath was ridiculous. And you could actually go to some parts of the Dayton area and you could still see it because it's not even been fixed yet. So regionalism focused on the depicts specific elements of a geographic region. For that reason, it's characterized by writers' use of local dialect. So regionalism is going to have that geographic. So if the South, you're going to see the traditions of the South, their customs, their manners, their beliefs unique to that given setting. So that's why I told you, like down in Louisiana, the Creole, which were the French, it was a group of people, they were more during down in South in Louisiana, and they had their own dialect, they had their own customs, they had their own mannerisms, and they had their own traditions. Okay, so, but again, United States is a melting pot. We've got all of these things um, in our area, and everybody has their own different way of speaking. Okay, so there's one nation but many voices. America and Americans are undeniably changed by the Civil War. Its expansion and the growth of the country is in the second half of the 19th century. Many American writers address these changes by embracing the literature of realism, regionalism, and naturalism. In this activity, we'll learn about how regionalism and naturalism, some of their chief practitioners, and the importance of on American literature. So here's realism. It's that faithful representation of reality in literature, and this style of writing was predominant in America following the Civil War. So we have this, but the thing about it is, guys, we see it in the same thing in the Civil War, um, except for we don't have as many characters, don't have as many characters or in the settings or in events. Like they're not it's not usually nonfiction being portrayed as fiction. It is nonfiction. So, or fiction portrayed as nonfiction, sorry. That would be what realism a lot of times typically is. But a realist work rarely contains supernaturalist elements. Realist writers avoid emotion, sentimentality, striving instead for the factual accuracy commonly associated with journalism. Interesting. Does this sound unremarkable? That's because realism remains a popular form of literature. In the 19th century, however, realism was revolutionary. That's hard to imagine. So, this is your definition that you need to know. It's a faithful representation of reality in literature. So, these are all of realism. Okay, here's regionalism though. Regionalism is going to share the characteristics of realism, but it's going to depict those elements of geographic location. It's going to have a local dialect, traditions, customs, and manners. Whereas naturalism believes that it's going to again share the characteristics of realism, so everything that's in purple right here, but it's also going to have believes the individuals are the product of hereditary, like your DNA. Basically, this is when the theory of evolution started making its way into our society a little bit. Just so it's Darwinism. Darwinism actually started during this time frame, and it is a form of naturalism, just so we're clear. So focuses on intense or extreme situations. It deeply opposes the romantic opposite. It strips individual of power, and it's a determinism. Like if you've ever seen The Call of the Wild or um, any movie about having to get through nature when it's like extremely cold or whatever, those are determined to be determined, okay? So events and actions determined by the natural laws and environment. So realism versus romanticism. Before Civil War, romanticism dominated American literature. So recall that romantics believe that individuals have the potential to be perfect themselves and the ability to overcome any challenge or problem. So I would call that a little bit of what we are now. A lot of us, I think, can be a little bit on the romantic writers themselves. Um, so recall that the romantics believe that individuals have the potential to perfect themselves and the ability to overcome any challenge or problem. Not so the realist. So they reject this idea that we have the power to decide our own fates. Realists focus more instead on how the outside forces, events, and circumstances affect the people. Okay, so that was why Civil War affected so many people, and that's why I said it's kind of under the same umbrella. You have romanticism, which we already know is that's just a right here. All that is just a recap of what the definition of romanticism is. Okay, realism in the war. So realism became so popular in America in the second half of the 1800s, in part because of the Civil War. Shattered many romantic notions concerning humanity's inherent goodness, which we've already talked about this. So the savagery, though, of the war flew in the face of romantic optimism. The nation that witnessed death and destruction on such a scale embraced writing that included the gritty realities of life as honest and understandable, more in tune with the experience of everyday life rather than romantic works. So they enjoyed reading about what they're going through. Myself, I don't want to read about what I'm going through. I just don't. When I read, I want to read to get out of my ideas in my head and what's going on. And maybe some of you guys can identify. Now, when I'm in the right frame of mind, I want to learn and I want to experience, like I want to know what's going on in the past so that I can look at maybe how I can handle my own situations. That's when I'm being more like introspective. Um, that's where many people though were during that time frame. So this right here is really what I've already showed you. Okay, here we go. So then regionalism, um, let's break this down just a little bit. It really started early in the 1800s, because during that time frame, people were moving constantly. Um, they were, uh, if you were in the South or you were in the you were moving to the Midwest, the California Gold Rush, you had, I mean, just people were transient more than they were today. I feel like today we're more steadfast, like this is where I'm from, this is what I do. Very rarely do you see people fully pack up. Now, I am starting to see an uptick in that again. I don't know why, but I have my thoughts. So here's where it's interesting. So soda versus pop. So do you call carbonated soft drinks soda or pop? Your answer may be tied to the region you're from. In the Northeast, most people call the drink soda. So a story set in Philadelphia might describe a person ordering a soda. If the story described that person ordering pop, you actually might know that it's like around us in the Midwest area. Now, it's interesting because like if you go to Chicago, you hear soda, like you hear the O type of thing. If you go to, so it's a very different sound of the O's. If you go to New York, you will see the mannerisms more brusque, more hurried, more um sometimes even like I remember sitting in a restaurant in New York and I was like, whoa, that is, they're talking to their parent and they're like, just almost sound like they're just nailing them, like just being almost disrespectful. But it wasn't. It was a matter of way they talk. It's their customs. It's just the way they are, what the way they do things. Not wrong, just what they do. So naturalism though is it's kind of like realism on steroids. So it's going to talk to you about your heredity, um, in the environment are primary influences that's going to influence the character's behaviors and or their thoughts. So, for example, if you're brought up in a home life that is always negative, 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 there's nothing positive, or like you were taught that it's okay um, to be the victim. These are things I'm just thinking off the top of my head. Um, and this could be anybody, not pinpointing. I'm just saying this is typically would become a learned behavior. Okay. If you're taught a growth mindset, that's why, we do the 7 mindsets. If you're taught a growth mindset, you're not fixed. You're not like, nope, just because, I have this, this, and this, it doesn't mean that I can't learn or I can't do or blah, blah, blah. Those would, that's that growth mindset and that's gets programmed in your head. Um, but in naturalism, they believe that if you're born with like a disability or you're born with something, like they would say something like, well, that's going to limit you. That's not you. It's going to strip you of your power to be whatever you want. Like it's going to limit you. And it's I saw a video of um of a guy who has no arms and no legs, and he is a motivational speaker, and he is just tremendous. And I'm thinking to myself, if he was born in like the 1800s, how would he have been treated? You know, we're gonna get into like what happens with people who have severe mental disabilities, what they do in the early, like the 1900s, and what they did to them, which is the atrocity is awful. But this goes hand in hand with that naturalist viewpoints because um, they're basically thinking that you're at the mercy of external forces. So if your parents love you and they want to keep you, then they would keep you. It's crazy. So I'm not the biggest fan of naturalism. It's a little too harsh for me, but I like realism per se. So naturalism though works focus on intense, though realistic situations just show the power of external forces over the individuals. So I don't like ever probably being stripped of my power as a person. I don't know. So a naturalist view of crime. To expose the overpowering impact of external forces on individuals, many naturalist works focus on the characters who break society's laws. A criminal in natural stories is often depicted as someone who has been born into poverty, raised without moral instruction, denied an education, and surrounded by other criminals for his or her entire life. In the view of the naturalist author, the combination of these environmental and hereditary circumstances does not simply influence the individual to become a criminal, it leaves him or her no option. Now, I'm not saying that there's not an actual a grain of truth that could go with that, but they're leaving out the idea that change is possible. So I will tell you that. So, um, and it's so though regionalism, naturalism are outgrowths of realism, all three types of literature share some characteristics. And a single work can have qualities of more than one literary movement. So that's a big key factor that you have to understand. For example, a work may contain naturalist and regionalist elements. You will be looking for elements of these literary movements as you read the works in unit. Okay, so again, um, naturalism, just as a real way of putting this, it's a detached, almost scientific style of writing. So the scientific method was very big during this time, popular in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries that explore people in conflict with forces greater than themselves, such as nature, society, and their own physical and intellectual limits. Okay. So, as the 20th century neared, American literature expanded with the country. A single literary movement or philosophy could not define such a large, diverse nation. American writers expressed various viewpoints that reflected the many sides of America and different experiences of Americans. So, inevitably, the viewpoints expressed in one type of American literature questioned or challenged the viewpoints expressed in other types and periods. So what happens during this time frame is that they're going to question the Puritans. They're going to question the rationalists. They're going to question the romantics. They're going to question the transcendentalists. You're going to look at that. So yet, far from destroying or even hindering the strength of American literature, these challenges open the door to mature growth. This is what I like. Okay, so what it means is that they're not going to downgrade them, but they're going to explore them. And they're going to be like, okay, well, how did this get to this point? Or how did we get? So it's going to be very questioning. It's going to look at it from a scientific aspect. So for the return of the private, there is Hamlin Garland. Garland. Hamlin Garland was born in Wisconsin in September of 1860, less than a year before the Civil War began. So Garland spent his childhood on small farms in his home state, as well as South Dakota and Iowa. At the age of 24, Garland moved to Boston to pursue a career as a writer. So in 1891, Garland's first collection of short stories, Main Traveled Roads, was published. This included The Return of a Private and served as an example of the type of literature that Garland sought to promote. Realistic realist fiction filled with authentic regional details. So then Garland moved to Chicago in 1893 and continued to write fictions and essays about the importance of realism in American literature. He published his first novel, Rose of Duchess Cooley, in 1895. Um, so Boy on the Life of the Prairie. So you guys, this is one of his major works or whatever. Um, but it does give like what like I said is an accurate and honest account of 19th century boyhood. So this is high praise considering that the two of the most famous books in American literature also focus on the 19th century boyhood, which is Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, both of which have been at one point, I know Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, maybe not Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but Adventures of Huckleberry Finn were both banned due to the use of what they would call offensive language. Um, but again, it was what they heard. So when we read, and I'm just going to give you a heads up, when we read something that's realist fiction and it's going to have local dialect, or it's going to have the dialect, or it's what we call local color, you are truly going to get how they would have spoken. Um, you are and how they would say things. So a lot of times you may have to look up what something means. You're like, what does that mean? Because that doesn't, the same connotation doesn't, I don't get that. Okay, so that's something you have to understand. Um, you guys, this is basically all about Garland Hamlin and how he, you know, he married Zulaim Taft, the sister of famous sculptor, the following year. Garland continued to write stories and novels about the Midwest and Great Plains. But mainly what was kind of cool is he focused on the lives of farmers, white settlers, and sometimes writing about the Native Americans of the regions. In 1915, he moved to New York City and began to write more about his life, his family's history. But so that's kind of the gist of it, guys. That's it. Okay. Overall, hopefully you got a basic understanding of the regionalism, realism, and naturalism movement, because those are very important to understand all of that. Because remember, realism is the big umbrella with regionalism and naturalism underneath. Um, I will tell you, I need you guys to. So this is a realism lit movement. So this is all this is right here is it's like a Prezi, but it gives you some visuals of things that I really didn't kind of give you too much. So realism, like I said, we already have like it's kind of like an overview of the rapidly changing, but something I didn't kind of talk about was that it's because it was brought on because of new technology, more information. Writers grew tired of the out of touch romantic time to keep it real. Um, and then we have what they wrote about was factory workers, corrupt politicians, weary housewives, construction workers. Um, this right here is Ashcan School, and this would have been a picture of the Wright Everett Shen 1899. The fight of Everett Shen 1899. So this is where you would have seen like a depiction of people fighting. Okay, and then this is like the slums. This is the backyard. This is what you would have seen in your backyards in 1888. Okay, there's a little bit better viewpoint of it. And then so that whole thing, the factors of what really brought this on was the Civil War, the expansion of the railroad, invention of the telegraph, mass immigration, rapid industrialization, less agrarian, more urban life. These are all huge changes for people during that time. And again, this is the Battle of Gettysburg that stunned America. I will tell you right now, the second inaugural address that Abraham Lincoln wrote, um, you know, was spurred because of the brutality that he saw on um, the battle after the Battle of Gettysburg. He also talked, he has a letter about how his own personal life was completely changed. So, but this is the first time this was ever shown. And then we have Stephen Crane. So Stephen Crane is best known as an ironist who agreed with grim naturalist philosophy. That's who one of the people we're going to look at. Um, and he is like talking to like in one of them it's like short poems about yes sir I do exist. um yeah, and he we will read like Ambrose Bierce. But like this, listen to this: the blade shot forward in a human body, the citadel of virtue, wisdom, power was pierced as easily if it had been a melon. So the visual imagery used is just phenomenal. Okay. We already went through all of this, but here at Beecher Stowe, Bret Harte, Kate Chopin, Mark Twain, these are all your regionalist writers, typically, not all of them, but a lot of them. Um, and why in the world would somebody still study Mark Twain? First of all, what's so awesome about the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Why are they people still fighting to keep this in the as one of the classics that kids read in high schools? It's first you can read it as a rollicking, fun childhood adventure. Or you can read it as instructional life on how to be a man, or you can read it as a biting social commentary against the treatment of African Americans. And also how they allowed kids to kind of run and do their own thing. There's a lot of things that Mark Twain was always known for. He was considered a satirist, and that's something you need to understand. He was very satirical about everything in reference to that. So when you're dealing with naturalism, though, here's something they're going to look at the psychology, the sociology, the biology, and the environment. So for those of you that like to read like psychological stuff, you'll like it. If you like reading about what's going on in the customs and stuff, you'll enjoy this naturalism aspect. So, Frank Norris, most people don't even know who that is, tended to look at life as grim losing battle. The universe is powerful, they argued, and completely indifferent to our happiness or survival. Sort of a bummer, no. So his best known work was what's called The Octopus, a raw tale of struggles between wheat farmers and the railroad monopoly, which is really strange because you wouldn't have thought you would call it the octopus. So again, we have that man versus nature, nature wins, man loses. That's naturalism. And there you go. Okay. So I gave you just a real quick sum up of what is going on. Okay. And that is, in a nutshell, this entire component that you're looking at. But how in the world does the psychology of in-group versus out-group affect so much of that concept? Because you remember how we talked about the role of fear today in class. Let's look at this because this is really important.
And this was part of the research of the great social psychologist Henri Tajfel. Tajfel was born in Poland in 1919. He left to go to university in France because as a Jew he couldn't go to university in Poland. And then he enlisted in the French military in World War II. He was captured and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. And it was a terrifying time for him because if it was discovered he was a Jew, he could have been moved to a concentration camp where he most likely would not have survived. And in fact, when the war ended and he was released, most of his friends and family were dead. He got involved in different pursuits. He helped out the war orphans, but he had a long-lasting interest in this sort of science of prejudice. And so when a prestigious British scholarship on stereotypes opened up, he applied for it and he won it. And then he began this amazing career. And what started his career as an insight that the way most people were thinking about the Holocaust was wrong. Many people, most people at the time, viewed the Holocaust as sort of representing some tragic flaw on the part of the Germans, some genetic taint, some authoritarian personality. And Tajfel rejected this. Tajfel said, what we see in the Holocaust is just an exaggeration of normal psychological processes that exist in every one of us. And to explore this, he did a series of classic studies with British adolescents. And in one of his studies, what he did was he asked the British adolescents all sorts of questions. And then based on their answers, he said, I've looked at your answers, and based on the answers, I have determined that you are either, he told half of them, a Kandinsky lover, you love the work of Kandinsky, or a Klee lover, you love the work of Klee. It was entirely bogus. Their answers had nothing to do with Kandinsky or Klee. They probably even heard of the artists. He just arbitrarily divided them up. But what he found was these categories mattered. So when he later gave the subjects money, they would prefer to give the money to members of their own group than members of the other group. Worse, they were actually most interested in establishing a difference between their group and other groups. So they would give up money for their own group if by doing so they could give the other group even less. This bias seems to show up very early. So my colleague and wife Karen Wynn at Yale has done a series of studies with babies where she exposes babies to puppets. And the puppets have certain food preferences. So one of the puppets might like green beans. The other puppet might like graham crackers. They test the baby's own food preference as a baby, and babies typically prefer the graham crackers. But the question is, does this matter to babies in how they treat the puppets? And it matters a lot. They tend to prefer the puppet who has the same food taste that they have. And worse, they actually prefer puppets who punish the puppet with a different food taste. We see this sort of in-group, out-group psychology all the time. We see it in political clashes within groups with different ideologies. We see it in its extreme in cases of war, where the out-group isn't merely sort of given less, but dehumanized, as in the Nazi perspective of Jews as vermin or lice, or the American perspective of Japanese as rats.
So you guys think about that, okay? That is important to the in group versus out group. We see it all the time. And we're actually starting to see it again as a rise and an uptick of how people are viewed. And I mean, it's went so bad as we see things like the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. I mean, my goodness, it's we've got like you're a Republican versus Democrat. That has never changed. And this concept, um, is very important to understand that you don't have to teach people how to want to discriminate or to that is just innate. All you have to do is say, well, this one gets more special treatment. And that's what he was basically talking about is the in group versus out group. Um, so then you're probably like, well, how do you fix this? How do you change this? Well, that's something that's continually going through people's minds, and it will probably continue because the psychology of the in group versus out group um, has been studied for years, for decades, centuries. Okay. So our thing is we can glean and learn as much as we can from the literature we read and from historical components. So there you go. There is your whole thing in less than a normal class period, if you really must know. All right, and that's with me talking. So I hope that that helped you. So that all will play portion of the cause of the Civil War quiz, and you will have it's only about I think 11 questions. It's not real long. So hopefully that shouldn't take you very long to finish that. And yes, I have opened it. Um, the regionalism, realism questions are not on there because it's going to be, you'll get that on later afterwards, okay? So then what's going to happen is Oh Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman. I'm going to need to do a complete video on this. This is a benchmark testing one that I'm looking to see where you have grown um, in per se from the beginning questions that we had on your pre-assessment to where you are now. So hopefully you can see you've grown in imagery, your figurative language, you've gotten better, you've gotten stronger with your writing, stuff like that. All right. So I hope this helps and see you all later. Bye.